Hi all, can everyone hear me okay? Just give me a little thumbs up. Awesome. Okay. I think I'm gonna just introduce myself and get us started. I'll keep admitting people as we go, but welcome to the VCLN grant writing workshop. It is so awesome to have so many people here. Just to give you all a rundown of how this is gonna work, I'm gonna introduce myself, talk about how we're structuring today, introduce our panelists, and then I have a few questions for our panelists, and then we'll kind of open it up to you all. And you can direct your questions at someone in particular or all of them. And I'm going to try to leave like 20 minutes to half an hour for that open question segment because I feel like that's really important. But welcome. My name is Hannah. I work at the Vermont Council on Rural Development. This is the first time I've done a VCLN workshop, but in my last role before VCRD, I was a grants management specialist. So this is a topic that I'm really interested in and know a little bit about. I want to introduce our panelists for today, who are going to say their name, what they do, and kind of how their work relates to grants. So if we want to start with Shannon and then go to Nate and then Alyssa.
Hi everyone, I'm Shannon Barsotti and I'm the Community Development Director for the town of Bennington. So I work on local economic and community development projects. I think my role really started with managing the community development block grants that come through the state and the federal funding. And it's expanded to be a lot more of kind of locally driven community projects that are related to a lot of grant writing and development too.
Nate, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Nate Cleveland. I'm a community development specialist with the Vermont Community Development Program within the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. We administer those CDBG grants, the community development block grants that Shannon was just talking about. And I also assist with other grant applications reviews throughout the agency within the Department of Economic Development, assisting other agencies like the Agency of Natural Resources, also municipal planning grants, and the NVRC funding and the CIP funding that was out there. We live in a world of acronyms, but I'm very happy to join you all this morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nate. And lastly, Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Johnson. I work with Hannah and the rest of the team at the Vermont Council on Rural Development. My title is Community Project Associate, and so I do follow-up work with a variety of communities, and it's nice to see some familiar faces on the call. I would say my grant experience is kind of a potpourri of experience, which is a little bit of a lot of different things. And so that's the variety of grants that communities apply for. I'm also involved in my local select board. So sometimes that's on the side of approving a grant application that someone else has written. And I had the opportunity last year to also serve on a statewide grant review panel. So get to see a little bit of that kind of under the hood, behind the scenes perspective of looking at applications that had come in from other folks. So happy to be here. Thanks, Hannah, for putting this together.
Awesome. Thank you, panelists. I'm just going to kick things right off and go through some questions. To start, I was hoping to ask Nate and also Shannon or Alyssa as this applies. I just wanted to ask, kind of starting with the positive side of grant things, what to you makes a really successful application? What to you makes like a grant application stand out?
For our program specifically, we like to see things in a very concise and detailed oriented narratives are very helpful. When you run into an application, and often what happens when you are submitting an application is you're submitting it amongst a pool of many other applicants that are competing for limited resources. And so being able to get your point across in the need, the impact, and the feasibility Those three pieces are a huge component of submitting a successful application for CDBG funding. Each program is going to have their own specific requirements that you're going to want to look into. So make sure the programs that you are trying to support through the grant applications that you're writing align with the specific programs funding priorities. Like with CDBG, there's a priority to fund projects that primarily benefit low to moderate income individuals, but there's multiple ways that you can show that benefit, whether that be through an accessibility modification project that you're doing on your local library or your municipal building, or if that's a public facility that serves a low income population within your community, whether that be a senior center or a childcare facility that opens up specific number of slots that prioritizes low to moderate income individuals as well. And most importantly, when you're competing against very competitive application rounds, having your other committed resources in play and committed in hand prior to submitting your application. The further you can be in the process of obtaining those other commitments from other funding sources, the more competitive you're going to be. It's basically shovel-ready projects that we are looking for. There's such a demand for the funding out there, and there's so many funds running around with new programs that are being stood up with ARPA money and the large, huge influx of federal funding that has come over the last couple of years to support the recovery efforts from the pandemic, that we need to be able to spend the money quickly. So there's a lot of expenditure deadlines that you need to keep in mind. So making sure that your timeline is going to meet the funder's timeline is also a very important piece. Supporting documentations is another key piece of that commitment of other resources, as well as making sure that the supporting documentation for the project itself, the cost estimates are verified and not just a back of the napkin type of a thing from a volunteer. You want to make sure you have it well spelled out and detailed out. It's nice to have volunteers, but you want to make sure you're checking on those volunteers that have that expertise that are guiding you. A lot of our projects we see are volunteer based, and so it's important to have that volunteer piece, but it's also good to reach out to a third party to verify those. Even, you can start with that volunteer estimate from say it's an architect that's working on a project pro bono, but you kind of want to double check those things. So that's another thing that we look for. Yeah. And as I said, need, impact, feasibility, and beneficiaries. Those are really the four that we look at.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate. Shannon or Alyssa, do you feel like you have anything to add on the grant review side of things before I ask you all about building those applications? Do you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I think Nate was very thorough, but I would just add partnership. I think that showing a really strong variety of partners on a project and then having those letters of support is hugely important for any grant application. And then the planning and feasibility piece is also absolutely critical. So as well as Nate said, leveraging other sources of funding or other even kinds of in-kind support.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. Alyssa, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think those covered the high points.
Awesome. So Shannon, to kind of jump back to you, and also Alyssa, as someone who's on the grant writing side, what are the kind of key points that you're thinking about when you're putting together an application? How do you prioritize some of those factors that we just talked about?
Well, I think really making sure that you understand the criteria of the funders And so there's kind of the checklist, like Nate said, you know, going through and making sure you have everything that's required, but also really trying to understand the mission of that organization, whether it's a state agency or, you know, a local philanthropic fund. You know, I think a lot of what grant writing is kind of matchmaking and trying to make sure that whatever project you're working on is really matching that mission and furthering that mission. I mean, I think that's what funders are looking for. And honestly, that's, I think, the most interesting part is that kind of narrative and weaving that together. So that's the top of the list for me.
Alyssa?
I think Shannon really captured, again, that matchmaking piece and kind of, as Nate was saying as well, making sure that you're hitting those points. I think just to back up a little, a lot of what we see on community projects is there can be ideas for a ton of different initiatives. A lot of the work we do at the Council on Rural Development is taking, like, we want to improve our town and saying, what does that look like as a specific initiative or a specific project? So before getting to the stage that you can even have a quote or estimate for what a project is, I think sometimes the act of just having to write down really clearly, like, what is the project we're working on? And also because oftentimes, especially in Vermont, we're looking at multiple different funding sources, multiple different ways that need to be all kind of woven together to fund a project. And some things may only fund really specific work. So making sure that everyone who's involved in writing the grant is really clear on what piece you're working on. You heard me earlier stumble over the word potpourri earlier, and that was because I think one of the things you don't want to see in a grant application, which I've heard called the potpourri application, which I think is funny, is like throwing a little bit of everything. You know, we're gonna build this and do outreach for this, and those might all be incredible initiatives, but it can sometimes feel like instead of really thinking out one coherent piece for an application, you're trying to put everything into one basket. And I think sometimes that can be hard to really be successful. So in terms of crafting the narrative, as Shannon said, that's really weaving together these pieces of what is the impact, what's the feasibility. Before you get there, you really have to get clear on, like, what piece of this can we pull out that's going to align with the funding sources we're using, and get really clear on that. I think the other piece, just to say, thinking about, is timing. To get a clear and complete and cohesive application that really demonstrates community buy-in with the letters of support, as Shannon was saying, it can be really challenging to do that on a tight timeline. And that isn't to say I haven't done many grant applications on tight timelines. I think probably a lot of folks who have done grants are in that boat, but I think the more you can back that up and have advanced time for review and follow-up and questions, the stronger your final application is likely to be. And again, even on the select board side, we had a group come in and say, we're planning to submit this application. It will need your approval. We're not here today for that approval. We're here today to just introduce you to the project, to let you ask some questions about it. And it really lowered the stakes, instead of us as a select board feeling like we had to, you know, wrap our heads around it and maybe like there would be some cause for concern. It just really lowered the pressure and let us say, oh, if we do have some questions, now there's some follow-up time for research. So when that final proposal comes back to us, we feel really confident saying yes with, you know, a really full show of support and letter of support that might have not been possible if we had a tighter timeline.
Thank you, Alyssa. So on the flip side of this, and I'm going to go to Nate first, along the whole kind of grant timeline, from finding the right funder and opportunity to working on budgeting and narrative to the reporting on the back end, what are some of the most common challenges that you see organizations face when they are trying to apply for a grant, successfully take that funding in and make it happen? What are some of the common challenges that you see?
I think we'll stay on that kind of theme of timeline, because a lot of projects, they think they're going to move forward really quickly, and then they don't realize that the funding stack that they're trying to do is going to compete against their timeline, essentially. A lot of projects, require multiple funding sources that have multiple funding priorities and multiple funding deadlines. So one of the things that we really like to encourage doing is in what we call an all funders meeting. So we will try to help coordinate with the project to make sure the right funding partners are at the table, first of all. Sometimes it's not even CDBG that's going to be the best fit for your program, or it won't be a Vermont Housing Conservation Board project. But me and my colleagues have experience with a lot of different projects, and so we can help point you in the right direction and make sure the right people are at the table to help you move forward with the right information that you need to create a timeline that's realistic and achievable. Those are two things that I think are super important. As Alyssa was saying, like CDBG requires the town to be the applicant, but it's often subgranted to a nonprofit, and then sometimes it can be subgranted to a for-profit to do work. It all depends on how you're tying back into the beneficiaries for our program. Making sure you understand what the true scope of work is that you're trying to accomplish through the grant is really helpful. Sometimes it's helpful just to take a step back, and though you know where you want to get to, you may have to go to B and then point C and then back to A and then to D, you know, and skip through. So you're going to go in multiple different directions, and it could be because of historic preservation work that has to happen. Often review requires HP, historic preservation buy-in, and review and confirming that the project is not going to have adverse impact on a lot of the historic buildings that you all are working on. The other thing is the pre-development timeline can be supported with other funding sources. So there, like I mentioned when I first started, municipal planning grants, and then there are also grants through VHCB to actually help you hire a consultant to get through the pre-development work. And that program is called the Rural Economic Development Initiative, READY. VHCB has that. They provide small awards for individual organizations to hire a consultant to help them write an application. So you get a grant to write a grant application, and hopefully you get that grant to support your project. So obviously that's going to take some time. So if you're looking to get a grant to hire somebody else, it just adds to your timeline. So typically making sure that projects also have that public support, because you could have a group that's working on something and then all of a sudden it gets to the point where you need public buy-in, and then you have to go back to point A to start all over again because there's a difference of opinion, or you realize that the project just can't move forward the way that you envisioned it. So I think the timeline is probably the number one challenging piece with projects that we see.
Thank you, Nate. You have a little compliment in the chat as to your guidance on applications, which is very nice. Shannon or Alyssa, could you speak a little more to some things that you might find challenging on the application side?
I'll have to agree with Nate that the timeline piece is huge. And I mean, just working for a municipality, you know, and Bennington we have a great team here with a lot of experience, but there's really not one project that's on time right now. And I think a lot of that is just the times that we're in, as far as supply side and labor and construction costs, all of it. So I think just it's frustrating, but understanding that things are going to take longer than you realize. And it really is worth the time to do the planning that's necessary. And I have some experience with the READY program that Nate mentioned. Before I worked for the town of Bennington, I was on the Pownell Planning Commission, where I live in Pownell, and we were able to receive a READY grant and then hire the Bennington County Regional Commission to put together a grant application that then resulted in funding to create a river trail. And I mean, even though I had some grant writing experience at that time, it was over my head, you know, to work with like 5 different river specialists, and it was quite a project. So I think having that kind of expertise and really trying to find funding for that is so helpful for some of these larger projects. And then also trying to really understand, you know, the time commitment that it's going to take, because in my experience, I've learned the hard way. Sometimes a $15,000 grant can take as much of my time as a $500,000 grant. So really trying to understand what that time commitment is and who's on the team that has the time to put towards, you know, everything that needs to get done is really important part of the planning process.
Thanks, Shannon. Alyssa, do you have anything you want to add?
I think Shannon touched on the biggest piece, which really is the capacity. Just to acknowledge, I recognize, like, in our work and also in some of the communities across the state, maybe there is that local municipal staffer or regional staffer who can help. But oftentimes, I think I just want to say it's incredible. We have 86 folks on this call, and it's because many of you are involved not in a professional role, but in a volunteer community role in grant writing for your community, and just saying, you know, folks have caregiving and work and a bunch of other responsibilities. So figuring out who's going to be the lead on projects, particularly in a volunteer capacity, I think that is a real constraint we see, whether that's, you know, a local board or commission that maybe meets twice a month and we're talking about timeline and, you know, folks fitting things in after hours. And so just both appreciating folks who are willing to do that work and also noting that it can be really challenging. I think finding really just the right fit for funding. I think we on this call are talking about some pretty specific, well-known and well-used community development funding in Vermont for some of you know, these bigger infrastructure projects. But I think for some of those kind of earlier stage or smaller projects, just finding that match between what the project or group has is and someone who's really interested in funding that can be a challenge. I would also say, though, in terms of strengths, I think, you know, we talked about earlier what stands out in an application. I think ultimately figuring out what that project is and becoming really crystal clear on what you want to see and getting the community bought in, I think ultimately will lead to better funding. And this is something, you know, our former executive director, Paul, said a lot, but like, come up with the project and the funding will follow. And that's not to be, you know, out of touch or overly optimistic, but I think ultimately, if you have a very strong and cohesive project, it's possible to find funding that maybe you didn't even know about that can help support it. But doing that can take a long time. And so that can be a challenge.
Thank you, Alyssa. I want to recognize that we do have some great questions in the chat. I see from Cynthia and Matthew, and I'll make sure we touch on those first in the kind of audience Q&A section. So don't think I've forgotten about you. I wanted to ask you all next, just because a few of you, I feel like I've touched on it a bit. Do you have any specific resources or technical support that you found really helpful? And this could be anything from, you know, finding the right match, finding the right organization to fund, or maybe a website or an organization that helps with this kind of thing. What kind of assistance or help is there out there that you think would be important to share with folks? And I think, again, we'll start with Nate, if that's all right.
Well, I think I don't want to take Shannon's thunder, but and Alyssa, because I think there is a limited amount of resources available for people to gain capacity and get technical assistance. And that's something that we've seen over the last couple of years is, and especially with the ARPA funding, is a need to support the technical assistance and build capacity amongst the nonprofits, the for-profit entities, all entities across the state that are trying to do community development, public service projects, and just move their communities forward and their projects forward. There is just only so many volunteers in the state and even paid people that are doing it, but there's limited capacity all across the state. So I'll give a shameless shout out to the VCDP. The Vermont Community Development Program is having a grants management symposium tomorrow at the Capitol Plaza in Montpelier. You probably can still register if you go to our website, but we also have webinars through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development on a lot of the various programs that we have. There is the community planning and revitalization team within the state. They really are very helpful in the municipal government side of things and looking at zoning bylaws, placemaking, various things like that, and are willing to step up and help. The Division for Historic Preservation Trust of Vermont. We also maintain a list of consultants for VCDP. So people that have had experience with managing grants are listed on our website, and we can't necessarily recommend one or the other, but it's a good resource of people that we know that have worked on our grants in the past. DHCD in general is a great resource. We try to get out, and like I mentioned earlier, we love to do all funders meetings with our funding partners that include NBRC, Northern Border Regional Commission, USDA Rural Development, the Arts Council. You know, as I keep going, I'm like, there are a lot of resources. I said at the beginning, there's not a lot of help out there, but there are. And there's a lot of funding sources. So each one of those funding programs is going to be a resource for you to reach out to, but specific to grants management, etc. I strongly encourage people to try to build a partnership with the regional planning commissions and the regional development corporations, as well as in the Northeast Kingdom, there's a group called the Northern Community Investment Corp, NCIC. They also provide a lot of assistance to the towns and nonprofits within the Northeast Kingdom to help move projects forward. There's the Vermont Economic Progress Council that they manage the Vermont Employment Growth Incentive, as well as the tax increment financing program. And so again, each one of those specific funding programs that you're looking at are going to be good technical resources for you to help maintain your timeline, first of all, but also help you identify what's important for that funder, what type of information you need to pull out and be very clear about when you're writing a grant. I mentioned that we want to keep things concise, but at the same time, I just also wanted to just point out that the ability for you all to talk about the residual benefit as well is important. So getting community buy-in and getting input on how your project isn't just going to benefit individuals directly, but what's the indirect benefit of that. So just wanted to put that plug out there too when you're talking to these various resources on how to move forward. Don't forget about the residual benefit or the ripple effect that comes along with it too.
Thanks, Nate. And again, I promise we will get to all of your questions that you're dropping here. We're just not at the Q&A section quite yet. Shannon or Alyssa, do you want to jump in with any more resources, technical support?
Sure. Well, again, it's hard to follow Nate. he's got a lot. He's got some great info. My screen froze for a second, so I don't know if you mentioned this, but I think another great resource is your local health department. You know, and I will echo again what Nate said, the regional planning commissions are hugely important, especially because most towns in Vermont aren't large enough to have someone who's a community and economic development person. So like in the case of Pownell, that's a good example that we really utilized the Bennington County Regional Commission for all kinds of resources. And they're great. So that's a huge one. And then the health department is what health departments are really excellent at is being able to look at that kind of bird's eye view of your whole community, really use data, like looking at census data, understanding, you know, kind of health impacts of some of the work that you're going to be doing. And I think that that's important to be able to take that long range view and partner with those agencies that have a lot of great data that they can help you understand.
Thanks, Shannon. Alyssa, anything to add here?
Nate did a really great job covering a lot of it. And with that addition, I think in particular, Nate talked about kind of down the road, this more formal maybe funders meeting of like really getting everyone in the room to talk, which strongly encourage. I would say even earlier in that than that too, like resources are your friends and supporters and anyone you think really wants to make that project happen. So like for us at VCRD, we want to see a lot of community projects happen. And sometimes that informal kind of one-on-one meeting with someone who does this work a lot and might be able to just throw a lot of ideas on the table. I think there's a lot of nonprofit organizations across the state, not just us, but who want to see work succeed and who are often happy to have that kind of first initial brainstorm meeting. So maybe Preservation Trust of Vermont, just someone who can sit in a room with you and say like, this is what we're thinking of doing. Maybe you don't fully know all the way how to get there yet. Or maybe you have a really specific idea. And again, it's walking through who are those different partners to bring into a meeting, but figuring out who those champions are. If you've been lucky enough to get the buy-in of your local town select board, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns offers services to those folks. And so if it's something involving a town partnership, they're another resource that can help. And also just to say, they do also put together some resources around, in particular, like all of the new state ARPA programs that are being rolled out. So maybe you aren't on a select board yourself, but you can still look at that PDF that's online and just get a sense of some of what's out there to maybe, talk to folks on your select board or research through other channels as well. And then I'll just give a shameless plug. I know we have a lot of Vermont Community Leadership Network frequent flyers, and folks have heard this before, but I will just say all of our previously recorded webinars and where this one will live are on a library on a workshop that we'll put in the chat. And we also have the Vermont Community Leadership Guide, which just resources and best practices from this work across the state. So in the more kind of static resources behind the scenes.
I didn't mention those folks, because a lot of projects that you're going to deal with if you're seeking federal or state money is going to require what is called a Section 106 historic preservation review. And that could be either archaeological or historic architectural historic features of a building. So reaching out to the division early on to get feedback from them is very important as well.
Awesome. Just one last question before we move into the open Q&A. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the grants landscape in Vermont and nationally has really changed since COVID. The funding that's available has been more plentiful. It's been different. There are different guidelines. And so to our panelists, I just wanted to ask, what do you think are some important things to know in this kind of new grants world that we're in after COVID? What's important for towns or organizations or individuals to know about the grant sphere right now?
I'll kick off just real quick. Most of our funding sources are going to require you to have a unique entity identifying number and registered with sam.gov, which are two ways of just determining it. UEI used to be the DUNS number for folks that are familiar with that. And so the unique entity identifier takes a little bit of time and setting up yourself within sam.gov. So as a nonprofit, any entity that we fund has to be registered with them, including any consultants working on the project. So that's something that we've seen actually a lot of smaller communities and a lot of small profits spend a lot of time trying to struggle through. So if you know you're going to be applying for state or federal funds, work on that simultaneously as you're working on your grant application. It would be one thing that I would recommend.
Shannon or Alyssa, anything to add?
We just had a meeting with a lot of state agencies. They came down to Bennington County and we met in Manchester on Monday. And one of the words that kept getting thrown out there was transformative. The amount of funds that are coming now and the impact that can have really is transformative. And so I think it is the time to think big and to take some risks, because we have this opportunity, and to really think about collaborating as much as possible and really having a focus on equity. I mean, those are the things that I think I'm hearing more and more of from every grant funder. And I think those are all good things. You know, and I think as far as the ARPA money that's still available, really trying to tie that to COVID impacts and recovery and understanding what the state is identifying as those target industries, like obviously the hospitality industry would be one of them. But there are a number of them, agriculture as well. So really trying to understand those ARPA priorities as well. If you haven't done that as a community yet, one of the things that we did in Bennington that was really helpful is again, kind of brought in a third party because we wanted to make sure that the priorities that the staff identified from the town, you know, that there was another set of eyes on that before we really opened that up for a whole community dialogue. And so we worked with White and Burke out of Burlington to help us identify our ARPA priorities.
Alyssa, anything else before we move into some of the questions in the chat and then Q&A?
Just to acknowledge, I think at least on the state side, one piece that we're seeing is that funding has been allocated, but a program may have not been fully stood up yet. And so there's kind of this bizarre thing where we understand that money will hypothetically fund this in the future for this type of thing, but you don't have maybe all of those super detailed guidelines around like what the specific pieces are. And I think just to say that it still feels like there's a lot of work behind the scenes around really defining the project. And again, those pieces of public outreach and buy-in and becoming really clear that can happen, but also noting that for some pieces of the newer funding we're seeing, I think there's this understanding that like there is funding, it will be coming, and that not all of the details have been worked out yet. And I think folks really across the spectrum of grant involvement are you know, you don't know what you don't know. And so some of that will need to change and evolve over time. But I think having a clearly defined project with as much detail as you can get is never going to be a bad investment of time. Even if it turns out one of these funding sources won't end up working, I think that it doesn't mean that you shouldn't move forward with, again, trying to get as clear as you can, even if all of the funding guidance hasn't been finalized yet.
Thank you, Alyssa. I want to work through some of these questions that have come up in the chat and then, you know, work our way into Q&A. The first one that we had was from Cynthia Shelton. And the question for our panelists was, besides letters of support, what other demonstrations of community buy-in are welcome, acceptable, useful for grant applications? And any of you can jump in. You don't all have to answer.
I would say, you know, start with all of your town boards and commissions or any other kind of long-standing organizations, volunteer or otherwise, is a great place to, you know, kind of meet and pitch your idea if you haven't yet. And I think that's another way to get feedback from the community and buy-in.
Alyssa or Nate?
I would say the best commitment that you can get is cash or cash in kind services from volunteers. A lot of you are volunteers, and a lot of you do some really great stuff in your professional private lives, right, on top of what you're doing with your volunteerism. So depending on what your expertise is or what the expertise is within your group, we could look at using some of their experience as a cash in kind service. So most grants are going to require a match. We require a 10% match on all of our grants. So, but that can be made up in cash in kind. Looking at the community to donate some of their admin time to help you support that, or if they're committed to maybe contracting with the Regional Planning Commission to do some of the grant admin, that is very helpful as well. But I also wanted to mention before we moved on, one of the other things about recent grant funding is the earmarks are back. so congressionally directed spending. And that ties into what Alyssa was saying with the timing. You may get an award from them, and then it's going to go through a federal entity like USDA or HUD. And so there's often things that you have to do on the back end. You got this earmark for a project, but then you have to do an environmental review, which will require some of the historic preservation. So just wanted to also make sure that that was mentioned as well. But the other ways of community support, I think public meetings are very important. We require at least one public hearing by a select board to support a project for an application for CDBG, but it's not, it's encouraged that you have multiple meetings to engage the community and the folks that you're targeting, making sure that if you are looking to do a senior housing project or a senior Meals on Wheels project, senior center stuff, that you're actually working with the folks that you're serving, so is there beneficiary buy-in? So go to those direct beneficiaries and get their feedback. Don't just do a public meeting, but do some targeted outreach as well.
Melissa, anything to add, or should we move to the next question?
I think we're good to move on. Thanks, Hannah.
Awesome. The next question that I saw was from Matthew Flaherty. And as I'm, repeating these, if the actual question asker wants to jump in or correct me, please feel free. Matthew Flaherty was wondering if there were organizations or services that could offer a review of grant applications before submission. And if there's anyone that offers that for free or at a reasonable rate. If any of the panelists have any resources around that.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, if I can jump in too, it was specifically, we're sort of in the process of filing as a nonprofit. We're providing programs now, but with the nonprofit, we feel like that'll expand our ability to get more funds. And yeah, we're just wondering, is there anyone that we could send the information to before submitting it to the state? That would be a huge help for us. So
I would suggest if you know any local attorneys that might be willing to do some pro bono work, really having an attorney look at it. Are you applying for a 501c3?
yes, yep.
Yeah, I have some experience with this too, that going through the IRS. Yeah, the more that you can get some eyes on that, and especially from the legal end. I think that the IRS has been, getting a little tighter on those applications to really make sure that the two main things when you're thinking about a 501c3 are your charitable purpose and your educational purpose. If you have both or either or, they really are going to want to see that that's the most important thing, I think, from the IRS point of view. So you just got to make sure that that's front and center.
If I could just jump in as a random person that none of you know, that is a great idea, but also reaching out to an attorney can be expensive. And I would follow up with recommending that you reach out to nonprofit support groups in your county before you engage with an attorney to the point where you have to pay money. It's my understanding in Vermont that there's a lot of great support groups for startup companies and stuff. So depending on which county you're in or town, do a quick search about that.
Okay, would that be like the Chamber of Commerce?
Where are you located?
We're in Washington County in Barry.
I would do a search for Washington County, community support groups.
Okay.
Just as someone who's worked in the legal field for a long time, it's gonna cost you some money. So
Well,
once
yeah,
you
I guess,
start talking to a lawyer, but there's community support groups that can help you, like guide you to some documents that you wouldn't have to pay for.
right, I guess like the follow-up would be, how uncommon or common would it be for us to send it in by ourselves without needing to hire an attorney? Like, would that be uncommon to get that approved if we just do it ourselves?
Most people don't.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Moving on to our next question. Mary Harwood was talking about a historic preservation and restoration project. She's located in Grand Isle and has learned that Grand Isle County is the only Vermont county not eligible for a lot of funding. And is there any working around this kind of hurdle? Do our panelists have any feedback on that?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by Grand Isle not being eligible. So as a county, typically the grantee or the grant applicant is a municipality or a nonprofit, so it's not usually the county itself. But we have made awards in Grand Isle through CDBG, so I know that we've supported projects up there.
Mary, I can see you're here now. If you had anything you wanted to add to your question about Grand Isle County specifically, feel free. Shannon or Alyssa, if you had anything to add as well.
I don't.
Okay. Mary, if you have any additions, to that question, please feel free to drop it in the chat. Our next question was from Kyle Noose, who wanted to know if there was a template that you could use to sort of pre-plan, make sure you have all the right pieces in place for your grant application, just as like a helpful tool before you apply. Do any of our panelists have any recommendations around a resource like that?
We have pre-applications that we ask people to fill out for CDBG funding. We try to get everybody to submit one and send that into our staff to get feedback on not only eligibility, but on the various competitive pieces that can make your project more competitive. How you can express the need and impact and the feasibility, essentially moving forward on that application. The thing that I always encourage people to do if you're doing planning activity is write out your scope of work that you're trying to accomplish and what the end product is going to be as a result of the planning effort that you're trying to do. Are you trying to develop construction plans for a historic building, or are you trying to just do conceptual plans of a streetscape to redo a downtown area, to do bulb outs, to do traffic calming, those type of things? But what's the end result that you're trying to get to? And if you can describe that on paper and put it down in a way that you can go to somebody and hand them a piece of paper, they would understand what you're trying to accomplish. I think that's one of the best exercises, is just really getting a clear scope of work set up early on, so you know what you want to get, and then you can break it out by the various activities and the various expertise that you need to go after, whether it be an architectural historian versus an architect, so those pieces, then it allows you to target the consultants as well.
Awesome, thank you, Nate. Shannon or Alyssa, anything to add on this front?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. Kyle Noose, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, wanted to know if there was a template out there that one could use to do pre-planning, to make sure that you have all the pieces or you have the right funding match before you apply.
Yeah, I think most of the larger grant funders are going to have something that you can use. I think Vermont Community Foundation has some great kind of pre-application questions and forms. And then the Agency of Commerce and Community Development has that as well, like Nate said. And then I think AARP, their community challenge grants have some good templates as well.
Thank you, Shannon. I wanted to move to our next question, which was from Jeff Gebhardt. And Jeff wanted to know, Jeff is in a non-government volunteer group that works in 5 towns. They are not a committee of any single town, and they are not registered as a nonprofit. Jeff wants to know if that group will need to register as a nonprofit in order to be considered by grant funders.
I can start and just say, I think kind of like the last question, some of this depends on what type of grant funding you're looking to receive and from who. And again, Nate can speak to, like, some require it has to go through a municipality. So that would need to be that. Some need it to go through a 501c3. I know at least the Vermont Community Foundation sometimes allows for it. It's a fiscal sponsorship. So another organization that does have that 501c3 status can essentially be that, like, money holding organization that would actually receive the funds on behalf of your volunteer group. And sometimes they allow towns to do that as well. So there are mechanisms. Not every group necessarily has to become their own 501c3, but kind of like with the last question, some of that also depends on what type of funding you're trying to obtain.
I agree.
Me too. And we've had experience working with fiscal agents. And I think you just want to make sure you're working with a group. If you are going to work with another nonprofit as your fiscal agent, that they've received grants before, have some experience with that. Usually, not always, but usually it is common practice to give them some sort of payment for that service. So that's just something to discuss too.
Awesome. Thank you, panelists. I wanted to move to this question from Katie, whose arts granting fund does not seem to be reaching minority groups in her area. She wants to know how she can increase outreach around this, which is a great question. Thank you, Katie. Panelists?
Can I ask what area she's living in? No, she's still there.
I'm here. Sorry, I'm sneaking in. I'm meant to email you guys. I'm actually sneaking in from Oregon. One of my best friends lives in Vermont and is fully involved in the nonprofit field here. And she just asked me to or sent me the link here, and I'm just sneaking in on your conversation. So if you feel like this is something that is out of your scope, I am okay with that. But I know that you guys, I would say, or Vermont as a nonprofit space, do so much great work. And so I'm just trying to hang out here and learn some stuff from you. So
great. I have no problem with that. I was actually asking just specifically what part of Vermont you were in, or your friends, or even if you're in Oregon. I mean, looking to groups like the NAACP, some towns, Vermont, so many towns are so small and they're not connected to larger organizations. But I know that, for example, our school system has an equity committee now. So you might look to your school system or other, kind of larger institutions in your town and who are serving a lot of people, whether that's the hospital, the school, and hopefully those larger organizations are really starting to think about diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think that's a good place to start as far as outreach.
Thanks, Shannon. Alyssa?
And I can just add quick, the Vermont Community Leadership Guide that you can view from afar wherever you may be as a PDF has a couple of sections around, it's more oriented at kind of inclusive community outreach, but just to think that, for inviting folks to a conversation, I would say some of those best practices probably could also be reversed to think about being ways to help spread out and share information. So there's a couple of sections that might offer some ideas as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. We had a question next from Penelope, who said, it's frequently difficult to understand how the various federal and state funding streams exclude each other. Like if you get one grant, you can't apply for this other grant. Is there a sort of central place for information to help with questions like that?
I think the unfortunate answer is probably no, there's no central piece, but speaking to each funding source directly, like for instance, CDBG becomes non-federalized, even though it comes from HUD, it comes to the state first, and then we grant to the municipality, and it's considered non-federal funds, so we can match USDA rural development or NBRC funding. But then there's other programs like NBRC, the Northern Border Regional Commission, that has a threshold of you cannot have more than 80% federal funds included in one project without 20% match. Some of those specific programs are not going to budge on their interpretation of those statutes that dictate how we have to manage our programs. So really that it's working with that funding stack, and again, going back to that all funders meeting to make sure you have everybody at the table that's in your sources and use budget, to make sure you understand how they interact with each other, because one project or one funding source may require Davis-Bacon wage rates if you put it into construction, but if you put it into soft costs like architectural or engineering, you don't have to pay that cost and you don't have to worry about doing the Davis-Bacon reporting. But another funding source might still require that. So it's just a matter of making sure, unfortunately, that you have those conversations early on. We don't have a very good resource. One thing that comes to mind, though, is the Procurement and Technical Assistance Center, PTAC, that is run through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. They can help with procurement issues specifically, and I know they've helped folks with SAM.gov and UEI. I see there's a hand up, so I can pause right there.
Hi, Nate. It's Penelope, actually, and you're helping us at the Craftsbury Community Care Center with our grant. And this actually is something that I think a lot of people are coming up against these days. As Nate knows, we secured a really good CDBG grant for our project during the center part of the pandemic. And then, of course, when we went out to bid, everything went nuts. And so now we're trying to find grants that will be compatible with this. We've got a concurrent project that's part of the building renovation. So we're basically looking at every possible funding stream to see how we can close the gaps that are a result of the current construction environment. And what I'm trying to avoid is peppering Nate every day with a question that says, so we're looking at this one. So I saw Governor Scott just, announce this one. Would this be okay? Would this conflict? Could we do this one? And that's what I was hoping to avoid. It's not just Nate. We have a USDA grant on the kitchen project. So putting together these vast packages on these larger projects without driving your best resources, such as Nate, out of their minds, is kind of where I was going with that.
I appreciate that. Something that I like to tell folks when we're working with them is start an email. Don't put my name on it yet, but at the end of the week, you're going to have a list of questions to send to me, and be like, these are what I need to talk to you about. And sometimes it's better just to set up a time to go through a larger list of questions, and really take the time to do that. We're all happy to do that here at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. We pride ourselves in the ability to provide good guidance and resources to our applicants. So don't ever hesitate. It would be my first thing to say. Don't hesitate ever to get in contact with us. But if you know you're going to have a bunch of questions, lump them into one email and then we can set up a time to go through them. But I appreciate you being conscientious of everybody's time, because everybody is very busy with all these new funding sources coming in. And as it's been mentioned before, a lot of them are being stood up. So they may be accepting applications on a rolling basis. They're still trying to figure out some of those requirements too, and read through and get guidance from attorneys and the federal funding sources that are providing those. So no question's a bad question.
Thanks, Nate. I wanted to move next to a question from Tia. What source do you recommend for placing an in-kind value to volunteer services? This ties back, I think, to our question about, good supplements, letters of support, things you need for an application. Do any of our panelists have any good recommendations around that?
I do know, I did see a form for volunteer in kind, and we just wrapped up it's called a CLG grant, and this is through the Division of Historic Preservation. Devin Coleman heads that up, and they have a very specific rate that they have for volunteers, and they have a whole form for it. So I don't know. I mean, I think some of that, I don't know if it depends on the agency or funder, but I thought that was really helpful that they actually gave the rate that we could calculate.
I know, sorry, I know we have used, like if it was a volunteer architect or whatever, putting a dollar value that's close to what they would charge out is fine to start as a reference. But if it's just like a general, say it's the Planning Commission going after a grant to help do a planning grant to design streetscape, for instance, we're not going to allow you to assign $25 an hour for every one of the Planning Commission members that's doing that, because that's what they signed up to do, right? But if it's project specific, like if you had somebody that has expertise, like a lawyer, engineer, or whatever, you could look at their professional going rate as a cash in kind. But if it's somebody that's just doing project management and just volunteering their time to coordinate all of the various consultants and stuff, we always say that $25 an hour is a good place to start at. And then what we do is we bring that to our compliance staff, and I'm not sure if they actually confirm with HUD if there's a preferred cost rate for various volunteers, but we bring it to them to let them push back on it if they have any issues. But I haven't seen anything in the
independent sector lists $29.95 as the IRS rate.
Perfect, thank you.
I think we have reached the end of our queue of questions, so I'm just going to start calling on people with their hands up. I see Kelly Kimball has her hand raised if you wanted to ask a question.
I have a very straightforward question. I think for board volunteer work, is that appropriate to capture the value of that?
I think if it's project specific, yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
Anyone else have a question for our panelists?
I wanted to try to dig a little bit into the Grand Isle project, because I noticed that it was a historic preservation project. So if that person wanted to share a little bit more about that, maybe we could get some more specific guidance.
Here she is.
Should I unmute?
You're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. The question was, we had the money that the governor just announced. We found out we're not eligible because Grand Isle County is the only county in the state that's considered, I think it's called attainment county, and we're in the midst of fighting that. But basically It's the oldest historic structure in Grand Isle County. It's the meeting house in South Hero. And we're in the midst of, we've got a Bruin grant from Preservation Trust for the foundation work. And we're moving forward to do a bond issue, but we're still going to have to raise a lot of money for things like accessibility and a lot of other things. So that's what we're looking at, a lot of different potential grant sources for that. Does that explain what our quandary is? It was just sort of upsetting to find out we couldn't qualify for that one big grant ARPA funding round.
Do you know if that was the community, the CRRP Community Recovery and Revitalization Program?
I guess that's what it is. It's the one that the governor recently had a
So-
press release.
So you should reach out directly to them. But basically, my understanding is Grand Isle is likely in what is determined the metropolitan area because of its proximity to Burlington and South Burlington. It's a census
That's
designated
really
issue.
silly if you've ever been to Alberg.
So I have spent a lot of time on the McQuam shore actually and looking across, but one of the things that I would suggest is that CRRP program, it just has a 30-day priority for BIPOC communities and non-metropolitan areas. So you may be being lumped into that metropolitan area of Burlington just because of the way the census does it. So definitely I would push back against that and see what you can do. As I mentioned, I think that program specifically is still trying to figure out some of the priorities and keep everybody within the guardrails. So reach out directly to accd.crrp@vermont.gov, I believe is the email for them. But that's one of those ones where you want to work directly. We actually provided a planning grant for that project through CDBG funding.
Yes.
And we've been in communication about how we can help. So feel free, Mary, to reach back out to me after this call, and I'd be happy to help follow up on any other
Thank you.
questions you have.
Great, thank you.
I want to ask again, if anyone else had a question, feel free to, use the little hand raise or just ask.
Hi, this is Nancy Lepsick from the Cambridge Recreation Board. And I'm really sorry I had my phone on mute and missed the beginning. And I noticed it's recording. Can you give us how I can access the earlier parts that I missed?
Sure. So the VCLN workshops are all made available on our website, Vermont Council on Rural Development's little section for the Community Leadership Network. There will be a link that'll have the recording of this full meeting, and that should be up very soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Anyone else?
There was, sorry, I was just thinking on the inclusion and trying to touch base and trying to get more people involved with equity and underserved communities. There is a new program, and it's escaping me right now, that municipalities can sign up for equity and inclusion. Shannon, do you know that? Okay.
I think, well, are you thinking of Ideal Vermont? Is that?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, I can't remember if it's coming through VLCT. But actually Bennington is one of the cohorts of that program. So I think the goal of that is to have, a few different communities at the same time, kind of talking about what they're working on and sharing ideas. So we're excited to be part of it.
And I also put a link in the chat, but just to say out loud for folks as well, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns also has a equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging toolkit on their website that has a number of resources, including information about some of those funding sources, particularly for municipalities. So vlct.org/DEI will reroute there, and it's up in the chat as well. That also has both like general learning resources for individual learning for folks, as well as, again, some of these more institutional support programs for your local select board or other groups.
Awesome, thank you. I see Alicia, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, with your hand up, if you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. And I found this workshop really helpful. So thank you all for doing it. Would you recommend any other like grant writing resource or workshop for nonprofit organizations?
Panelists?
Often individual funders are going to do webinars and just general program specific guidance. So keep an eye on each one of those, reach out to them specifically if you're targeting them. Possibly working with the Regional Planning Commission might be a way to look at it. And then the Vermont League of Cities and Towns offers trainings as well for municipalities, but it would pertain to nonprofits often as well. So you might want to look there. Shannon might also have some better information though.
Those are great suggestions. I was going to say your RPCs, your regional planning commissions. I think Vermont Community Foundation is also really wonderful for working with nonprofits, and they have a lot of smaller grants and grants that are intended for, they're not an onerous process to apply. So that's a good way to start.
And last, specifically on the nonprofit thing, and thanks to Penelope, who also had this in the chat, Common Good Vermont is another resource, and they also have like a fundraising and development actually certificate program and a variety of other trainings. So again, that's in the chat and you can Google it.
I see a question from Penelope about a resource for grant writers other than regional planning commissions. Was anyone able to touch on that?
And to clarify, the question is about to find grant writers to help us, not a resource for me as a grant writer. So, everybody is slammed these days. So we're looking to see, is there somebody, we're shopping.
I can put the link to our consultant list in the chat.
Cynthia wants to know if there are any online directories of all the Vermont resources and acronyms we've been mentioning, or is this a project that needs a grant? That is a really great question. I don't know about one centralized resource. Nate and Alyssa and others have been really great about dropping some links in here, but I don't want to speak out of turn if anyone does know of a more centralized database of these things.
I think it was a good reminder for all of us to be careful about dropping those acronyms, because as with over 20 years of working in Vermont doing project management and grant writing, I have to say, Nate, some of the ones you were dropping, I was confused. I was like, who is that again? So just a reminder to all of us to make sure that we, acronyms are used a lot. So to explain what the acronym is important. Thanks.
That's a great reminder, Trish. Thank you. I also just wanted to offer, I will download the chat and I'm happy to compile some of these links and resources and comments made by our panelists. And then I can send it out to folks from this workshop so that you have access to all of that, if that sounds good. Not as good as like one huge database, but very close to it. Any other questions? Otherwise, I would love to just hear some final thoughts from our panelists, but I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask what they want. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thank you all. This has been a really, really great and informative workshop. I want to turn to our panelists one last time if they have anything they want to share before we close out.
Yeah, I'll just verbally spell out those acronyms. Community Development Block Grant Funding is CDBG. Vermont Housing Conservation Board is VHCB. So you probably heard me say confuse CHGB. it sounded, sometimes I say it too fast, so I'm sorry. DHCD is Department of Housing and Community Development. VCDP is Vermont Community Development Program. We administer the community development block grant funding. And then Vermont League of Cities and Towns is VLCT. So I really just want to thank Vermont Council on Rural Development and the leadership that you guys and everybody within your organization is doing. It is wonderful to be able to sit in and see so many people on this call trying to figure out how to move a project forward within their individual communities and make their community better. And as a result, the state of Vermont a much more welcoming place to be. So I appreciate everything that everybody's doing. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Nate. It's really great to have you here. Shannon or Alyssa?
Well, thanks also for inviting me. This was really interesting, and good luck to everyone on all of your community projects. I wish you success.
And again, echoing, just thank you all for being here. And I would just say, stay positive. We talked a lot about timing and acknowledging that some of this can be a really long thing. It's been a learning curve for me. And I think everyone sees that oftentimes these projects can take many years. And when you want to see change tomorrow, that can be really hard. So thinking about how do you balance maintaining energy and momentum in the short term while working towards your goals long term is something we all do our best to balance. But I would also just say we're always open. I'll put my email in the chat, but if you're feeling discouraged and need a cheerleader or a booster, we're happy to do that. And just because we thank you all for the work you're doing, and know it takes a long time, but as Nate said, it's really to make all of our communities and Vermont better. So thank you all.
Truly, thank you all so much for participating today. Again, this recording will be made available for anyone who couldn't make it, or if any of you want to go back and listen to anything in particular, the full recording will be available on our website. I will get that link out. And additionally, I'll be compiling the links and resources shared in the chat. I will demystify some of those acronyms, and you all will have a handy little list of some of these resources. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day and go forth and do awesome things. Bye all.